Hi, I'm Lowell Joseph Gallin, and I'm here with our guest, Professor Robert Wistrich. Professor Wistrich, good to see you again at the Vidal Sassoon Center, International Center for the Study of Antisemitism at the Hebrew University on Mount Scopus in Hebrew Har Sophim. We are going to be talking about a movie which premiered a few weeks ago at the Jerusalem Jewish Film Festival, the 14th Film Festival, at the Jerusalem Cinematheque on Theodor Herzl, which was narrated by Professor Wistrich. Here is Professor Wistrich's latest book, From Ambivalence to Betrayal, The Left, the Jews, and Israel, which was published in 2012.
Correct.
And Professor Wistrich, how did you come to narrate this film, which just came out about December 10th? And what makes it different from so many other films on Herzl?
Well, I'm not actually the narrator in the sense of my voice is not the voice-over voice, but I am the main commentator in the film who is asked to provide some insights about the life and politics of Theodor Herzl. And the film, I think, is unusual in the sense that it's vivid. By going to the locations which represent the different stations in Herzl's journey through Zionism in order to accomplish his goals diplomatically, but also providing the background to how he came to Zionism, I think this film does it in a very graphic and moving way, ultimately, because it shows that mixture of, if you like, triumph in the longer term sense, in accomplishing an aim that everybody dismissed at the time as utopian and unattainable, and also elements of tragedy, particularly in the personal life of Herzl, which I think are quite movingly illustrated. So I would say this film does a very good job in combining the personal and the public.
I have to agree. I was there at the Jerusalem 14th Jerusalem Jewish Film Festival to do an interview with a filmmaker who had a premiere of his film that evening, Eyal Boer's Liver Diet in Entebbe, and I got to see most of the Herzl film before that interview. And I agree that the way it was filmed, where it takes you throughout France and Austria to locations where Herzl lived and worked, brings it to life. You were mentioning to me earlier another location where Herzl had an encounter with which you have a very personal connection. Would you like to tell our viewers about that?
Yes, indeed. We're referring to Great Britain, which at the time that Herzl launched the Zionist idea was the empire on which the sun never sets. It was a period where Britannia ruled the waves, quite literally, and was the greatest empire on earth. And Herzl was conscious of this, and certainly of the need to get his message spread, both among Jews and non-Jews, in Great Britain. But he knew nobody in Britain, and for that purpose, he needed an introduction. And the man who provided that introduction for him to circles where he could spread his message was Israel Zangwill, who was a very famous Anglo-Jewish writer at that time, and someone who warmed to the Zionist idea. Now, my personal connection with this is in some respects unique, and it goes right back to my childhood. I was about 12 years old, and we're talking about the late 1950s, when I was present with my father at a time when two gentlemen from the English Zionist Federation visited our home. We lived at 24 Oxford Road in Kilburn, London, northwest London. And this area at that time was a bombed out, rather depressing, run-down, working class area, predominantly inhabited by Irish Catholics with whom I played in the streets. And it was also an area notorious for IRA collections.
When you say bombed out, do you mean it still hadn't been cleaned up from the Blitz and
Yes.
World War II even 15 years later?
Incredibly, there was at the top of the street a whole section where you could see Luftwaffe bombs had completely wiped out a number of houses, and they still hadn't cleaned it up. So that is astonishing. Today it's different, but it took a long time. Now the connection is, that why did these two gentlemen from the English Zionist Federation visit our home, to our great astonishment? Because they said, we'd like to put up a plaque on the right-hand side of the front entrance to this home, because we believe that this was the place where modern political Zionism was born. So we, even my father, who was a Zionist in his youth in Poland, was quite astonished, and I knew nothing about this at that time. But we agreed, or my father agreed, and the plaque was put up, and it said something roughly like this: in this house, on the 24th of November, 1895, Theodor Herzl visited the Anglo-Jewish writer Israel Zangwill, and the idea of modern political Zionism was born. And this plaque went up. So it became engraved in my memory as a young adolescent. I was maybe 12, 13 years old at most. And the name Herzl therefore resonated for the first time, because I'd never actually heard the name before. Later, when I was a student at Cambridge University, and I became interested in Zionism, for the first time I read parts of Herzl's diary, and I came across his description of this meeting, which is quite vivid. And he's describing not only the house where I lived, but the room, which was actually my bedroom when it was close. For a time it was my bedroom, later it became expanded to a salon. And this was the room where Herzl describes his meeting both with Israel Zangwill and his brother, and how it was a room which contained so many books and papers sprawled over a huge desk where Zangwill sat and wrote, and how he paced around the room expounding the idea of the Jewish state for the first time to an important intellectual in England.
So Churchill didn't sit in this conversation. Excuse me, Herzl. He walked back and forth.
Well, he was pacing like a tiger, you know, back and forth. And Zangwill, in his memoirs, says that he describes this Austro-Hungarian, very colourful, famous journalist who descended from the skies one day upon him and started, you know, parading these extraordinary and startling ideas, and in a curious mixture of broken English, because Herzl's English was not great, French, in which he was fluent, and German, which was his native language. And Zangwill trying to piece all this together and being startled, but knowing that this was an extraordinary moment in history. It was Zangwill that provided all the connections to Hitler. Sorry, excuse that. Excuse that slip. And the elite of Anglo Jewry he met with during that visit. He also gave a speech, which was his first ever public enunciation of the Zionist idea, to a society called the Maccabeans, appropriately enough. It was Zangwill who introduced him, and Herzl was very grateful, and I think this was the moment of transition for him, from being a journalist who had put forward an idea, not knowing if anyone would pick it up, and realizing that he could actually become potentially the leader of a movement, because he received a warm reception. In his own native Vienna, people had a rather mocking, dismissive attitude, in keeping perhaps with the Viennese temperament and you know, the kind of culture in which he himself had grown up. which are very skeptical, rather cynical. You know, this is an idea that can't be taken seriously. Whereas the people that listened to him in London at that time, they did not dismiss it. And that gave him, I think, encouragement. It gave him hope. Now, it was an astonishing feeling, and retrospectively, to think that I had actually been living in this house and working as a child and on my homework in the same room with this historic encounter with Theodor Herzl, and a turning point, a really huge historic turning point, when Zionism emerges in the light of day as a practical program, an idea, which can be implemented, and here's the man that is going to do this.
Is this something that Herzl saw in himself, or is this something that Zangwill saw in Herzl and helped Herzl see in himself?
That's hard to judge. I think in all these kind of interactions, there's a dynamic which, you know, is created through the meeting of two minds, two people. Herzl is still insecure, unsure of where to go next, what is the next step. He's still in the frame of mind of saying, my little book will come out, and I've done my bit, and then others will have to pick up the flag. And I think it's in that visit to England for the first time that the idea begins to gestate in his mind that perhaps he is the one that needs to actually take it a step further in a public way, which was not something that he necessarily thought at the time he wrote The Jewish State. He certainly had a kind of messianic feeling about, or rather a feeling of inspiration, but he didn't see yet the path to turning this into a political movement. And I think that's what began to happen in England in that brief visit. And the Jewish Chronicle, a couple of months later, publishes his outline of the Jewish state, and it's the first newspaper that does that. It gives him a platform, the London Jewish Chronicle.
What would the age difference have been in that encounter? Herzl would have been, what, about 35? He was very young.
He was 35.
How old was Israel Zangwill at this point?
Zangwill was, I think, a similar age to him.
Yes, they were both very young.
Well, they were both very young. Zangwill, I think at the age of 32, had written a book called Children of the Ghetto a few years earlier, which had made him famous in Victorian England. We're talking about late Victorian England. This place that I described earlier as a rundown working class area, in Zangwill's time was a very fashionable part of London. And when Herzl describes how he goes from Charing Cross in this carriage, you know, with horses, to Zangwill's address, he describes it as an upbeat, in an upbeat way. His only complaint is about the fog, the terrible London fog. But it's a fashionable address.
You mentioned the difference in mentality between London and Vienna. There's an expression, I don't know whether it's German or Austrian, but it goes like this. The Prussian says the situation is serious but not hopeless, and the Austrian, the Viennese, says the situation is hopeless but not serious. And this is the mentality you're describing in terms of how Herzl is viewed either humorously or satirically by people in his circles when he has these ideas. So going to London is the first time, and I know that it comes out in the documentary you did, that Herzl's encounters with wealthy Jews in France, such as Baron Hirsch, were not successful. Would you say it's only when he gets to London that he starts to get his first strong positive responses to his ideas?
Yes, I would say that. In France he made almost no headway at all, with one exception, that he found a man living in Paris who was like himself, an Austro-Hungarian citizen, Max Nordau, who lived in Paris, who was supportive. But otherwise, French Jews and the French establishment, political establishment of the Republic, the Third Republic, were ranging from indifferent to hostile to the Zionist idea. In Vienna, as we pointed out, particularly in liberal Jewish circles of the kind that Herzl himself came from, there were ranging from dismissive to hostile, including his employers at the newspaper, the Neue Freie Presse, who actually did everything to discourage him from publishing his Jewish State booklet. Even offered him money, tried to bribe him in order not to do it. They were so afraid, so fearful of the idea.
You meant in the film that you narrated comes out that when Herzl filed his reports about the court-martial of Captain Dreyfus, that his editors changed some of the words to tone it down. They didn't like what he was writing.
Well, they certainly didn't
death
like...
to the Jews.
Exactly, because Herzl was present at this this dramatic humiliation in public of Captain Dreyfus at the École Militaire, the French military school in Paris. He was there. He heard the cries of the mob, the Parisian mob, death to the Jews. And he recorded it faithfully, as any good journalist would. That's what he heard, that's what he saw, and he wrote it down. But his editors in Vienna were so alarmed that this, reporting this might give ideas, to the Viennese, as if they needed encouragement, because the anti-Semites had already won the local elections. They didn't need that kind of support. So they changed that to death to the traitor.
You mentioned local anti-Semites in Vienna. That would have been Karl Lueger, the mayor, who was so popular, who had so many Jews in his administration that some of his friends said, but we thought you don't like them, and his answer, if I'm not mistaken, was, I'll decide who's a Jew.
Well, yes, except that the Jews he actually had in his party or administration were baptized Jews, because it was it was a Catholic social party, and that was a requirement. But what is true is that he had personal friendships with Jews who were not baptized, and with wealthy Jews whom he needed to support his municipal projects. And that was the context in which he said to his own party members who were more militant, I decide who is a Jew. He was a cynic, in keeping with the, the general atmosphere of the city.
Now, your home that you grew up in, that plaque tells a story. You mentioned when the plaque was installed.
Yes.
You were telling me earlier about going back to visit the home. Not many years later, after your parents had sold it, and the plaque wasn't there.
Exactly.
Would you tell our viewers how it came not to be there, and how it came not to be restored?
Well, indeed. I went back to the exact address. I noticed that they had finally, reconstructed those bombed out sites. It took them 25 years, after the war. And I knocked on the door, and either the new owner or the new tenant, answered, and I was curious. I asked a few questions, and they said, what happened to the plaque? The plaque about Herzl and the Zionist movement. And they said, oh, well, first of all, it was defaced, and then somebody, they actually destroyed it. And so I said, oh, I'm really shocked. And did the Zionist Federation come back to you? And they said, yes, there was an approach, and they asked whether they could put another plaque up there. But we said no, because we didn't want, this kind of vandalism again. And I took this as a sign, that we're talking about 1969 now. I took this as a sign that already the atmosphere had changed significantly for the worse. And to have this kind of very visible marking of an important moment in the history of Zionism was already problematic. Needless to say, today, it would probably not even be considered as possible, because the climate has changed so much for the worse.
This is reflected very well in the film. At the beginning, it takes the viewer, it certainly took me, a few minutes to understand what's going on. Scenes are shown from examples of modern European Jew hatred, Nazi-like movements, rallies, marches, defacing of synagogues and cemeteries while a text is being read in the background. And it takes the viewer a few minutes, or it took me to realize, that's what Herzl's writing about in the 1890s. And yet the scenes that we're seeing in the film you narrate are from now. Point being, as Solomon says, there isn't much new under the sun. That's come back.
Ein chadash tachat hashemesh.
So it has come back. And when you saw in 1969 your home, and the sign wasn't there and they wouldn't put it back, that was one of the first signs to you that the England you knew growing up in was changing for the worse for Jews.
Absolutely. I think that there are cycles in these things, but we are certainly in one of the most striking downward cycles when it comes to the standing of, let's say, Israel and of Zionism. Zionism itself has become a word of abuse, quite literally. If you call somebody a Zionist, usually the person that does that is doing it in a deprecating and sometimes slanderous way. It's a word that has become equated with some of the worst horrors of the 20th century. And this is, I think, something that clearly has anti-Semitic implications today.
Professor Wistrich, thank you very much for the interview.
Thank you.
And we thank our viewers for watching and listening.